Hey guys. So I occasionally get the question, who makes my cover art and animations and show visuals and all of that stuff? And today I figured I would do a little walkthrough on how I make my art. I make everything that you see visually from my shows, from the cover art and all the animations. And this is just a little insight on how I made the cover art for my song Heat. Now, I'm using Cinema 4D, which is a 3D rendering program, and I'm using Octane Renderer, which is a path tracing render engine. I've been using this for about 12 years now. I don't full ass it like I do music, but still, it's something that I'm pretty passionate about and I really enjoy doing. So, this is the scene for Heat, and on the right side here you can see all of the different objects which make up the scene, and on the left here this is my viewport, and then in the middle right here this is the render preview. So basically over here I'm working with geometry, and I have materials here, and it's basically just assembling geometry, applying materials, assembling lighting, and then rendering it with particular settings. So the first thing that I want to talk about is these wavy canyon-like walls here. And this is actually pretty simple. Let me copy this and create a new project. This right here is actually just a simple Cinema 4D landscape. I can recreate this real quick by going up here and hitting landscape, and then if I zoom in, I have parameters over here. And what I want to do is set my width segments all the way down. Let me set the display to lines so you can actually see the individual polygons. And then let me just add like a sun object so we can see the actual lighting that's on this. Now, right now it looks it's really flat and low poly. And what I do is I increase the scale. And then I have my depth segments really high too. So now I'm getting this like horizontal, very striated plane. It has a lot of detail in the depth and very low detail in the width. I'm also going to disable borders at sea level so we get this kind of shape. I'm going to make this horizontal just so you can see how this turns into like a canyon. Let me mess with the random seed a bit and get something a little bit wavier. So the next thing I do is then use a subdivision surface object and then put the landscape inside there, and immediately this smooths out the edges. So you can see it goes from this like really blocky polygonal thing to this really smooth edged thing, and I can increase the subdivisions, and I think I only did 3 or 4. You really don't need a lot. I think I'll just stick to 3 because it's already like making the polygons super dense. Anyway, yeah, so I have this, and then maybe I'll make maybe I'll make it a little bit more deep and then a bunch wider. So now I have this like really cool sandstone-like wavy wall. Let me switch back to the cover. If I unlink my camera, let me reset this scene because it's kind of crazy, and zoom out, we could see how this is actually just 2 of these planes, these landscape objects that are sandwiching a little space. And then really it's just about positioning the camera in the right way to get it to look cool compositionally. Now I want to talk about the lighting next. So I have several lights here. If I bypass all of these, I also disable the sky and the floor. This is basically what the scene looks like unlit. This is just the default ambient lighting. And the lights that I'm using, I have a red light that is creating these reflections here. And it's important to note that the opacity of these lights are 0. If I turn the opacity all the way up, you can actually see that the light source is a sphere. You can go into the details and set the area shape from, I think by default it's rectangle, to sphere, and then you don't have to worry about like orienting the light in any direction, because then it's just an omni light at this point. And then in the Octane light tag, if I turn the opacity all the way down, then you don't see the sphere anymore, but you see the reflections of that. So I have a red one there, and this is using a black body type. So I can adjust the color temperature. By default, it's like this neutral white. If I bring it all the way down, it gets this really nice, pretty realistic, like black body lighting. It's like nice and red, right around 1000K. And then I have another one that's just kind of lighting the top end of that. And then there's this blue light, and this one is different. So if I increase the opacity of this, you'll see that this is actually a plane that is chilling right there, kind of on an angle. But it's a plane that's very long, and it has a gradient on it. So this type of light is a texture light, so I can actually apply a texture. In this case, it's a gradient, and it goes from this like purplish to this blue color. And this, I think, looks really good when you turn the opacity all the way to 0. You kind of get like this edge highlight, and I can experiment with like moving this down a bit. And actually, how I did the animation was by moving this light from down to up, so it the light kind of sweeps up through the canyon ridges, and it just gives this really nice blue edge to it. And then I'm going to talk about the sky here. So I use an Octane sky object and just set to black, just so the background is completely black and there's no ambient light. And by default, it looks like this. But I have a plane actually that is the sky object. So it's the scene actually looks like this, whereas this giant plane, and I'm moving the this plane around in a particular way. It also has a target object. Originally, it was linked to the camera, so that when I moved it around, it was always facing the camera. But basically, yeah, this is just the background cover art. This is a composite of some photos that I took, and also some artificial stars that I added. But yeah, this is a real sunset that I took on top of a mountain. But yeah, I'm using that as an emissive material for this giant plane. And in the animation, I'm just increasing the emission power of the sky so it gets brighter over time. But yeah, anyway, I may as well talk about these materials here. So the wall material is, this is what the node editor looks like. There's quite a bit of stuff going on, but I'll just briefly walk you through what's going on. So I'm using a universal material type. That's so I can combine things like metallic. I think sheen layer is something that doesn't exist with just the metallic material type. So universal just allows me to use all of these different shaders combined into one. Now this is a semi-reflective surface. I'm using this like purplish as the albedo, which is kind of just giving me the base color. Without it, it doesn't actually like reflect. It doesn't have any diffuse light reflection. So I'm using that. And then the specular's not doing anything. The metallic is, I just have the float all the way on. If I have it off, it's going to just be this completely matte material. So I have the metallic all the way up. And then the roughness, this is where it gets interesting. So by default, it's just going to be super shiny like this. And by turning up some of the roughness, we start to diffuse these reflections. And I didn't want it just like completely diffused. So I am mixing in this, this mixed texture. And this is a combination of noise that has the Y scaling really, really far down, so you kind of get like these extra striations in the material, so it's not so just like uniform. Basically just creating variation to create more striations in this material. It's really not that complex. Now, the sky material is very simple. This is a diffuse material because that allows me to use texture emission and basically use this texture as like a light source. Now I'm using the sky backplate, and then I'm just adjusting like a little bit of the hue and the saturation just to kind of bring it a little bit more vibrant and contrasty. It's really easy to overdo these values. But yeah, it's basically an emission texture, just cranking the power until until it looks nice. And then I also have a floor texture, which you don't see, but there is, initially, the first iteration of this looked a lot more symmetrical, where the camera was like right in between. It's the second scene that you see in the teaser animation, actually. It's a little bit hard to navigate, but it looked something a little bit more like this. And if I enable the floor, you can see that there is a floor right here. And something else interesting emerges. You'll see on the edges here, there is this like kind of cracked texture, and there's this other plane that is invisible that I call dirt. And this is basically kind of driving a dirt shader that is inside of the walls texture. And this is where the universal material really came in when it came to using the emission shader, because what I'm able to do is use this image texture and drive a black body emission as basically like a light source that is triggered when there is geometry that is intersecting it and driving the dirt map. So this dirt map is basically responsible for creating a mask for this emissive, fiery, kind of lava-like texture. The way that I'm doing this is it's going from the dirt map. If I turn the radius down, you'll be able to see how it constrains that material. Now this dirt plane right here, if I turn on camera visibility, you should be able to see that there is a plane that is, I think it's actually behind this wall. Yeah, there's this plane right here that's kind of intersecting this wall right here. And what that's doing is it is driving the dirt map. So basically, where this is intersecting, this dirt map emerges, and then I'm using the dirt map as a mask for the black body emission. And then turning off the general visibility by using an Octane object tag, or I turn up the general visibility and turn off the camera visibility and keep the dirt visibility on. There we go. So that the geometry is, the material is still detecting that there is intersecting geometry in order to drive the dirt map. Anyway, I feel like I talked way too much about this already. After I got this scene down, here's my post-processing. Basically, it's not too much going on. In the camera imager, the exposure, I'm turning the exposure down and the highlight compression all the way up just so we don't get clipped values. I'm turning the vignetting up just a little bit, just for taste. I always like adding a little bit of vignette. And then the post here, this is really doing the magic. By enabling the post, I have the bloom power up a little bit and then the glare power up somewhat, and this creates these light spikes. I have the ray amount set to 2, just so it kind of creates these X's. I really like that look. I use that in a lot of my art. Glare angle 45, and that just adjusts like the angle that they're at, 45 degrees. And then glare blur kind of softens the sharp edges of those spikes. And how I render this, I'm not actually using the picture viewer renderer. I'm using the Octane's live viewer under File. I like to export as a PNG 16-bit image. So once I exported that, I open it up in Photoshop, and then here's where I do the post-processing. Basically, this is just a bunch of layers and adjustment layers and stuff on top of this render here. So this is what the original render looked like, and I guess I'll go from the bottom up to show you how I did this. So I have a couple smart filters. I have unsharp mask just to sharpen up the smaller details. And then I'm using, in the blur gallery, there's this awesome effect that's called path blur. And it lets you create effects like this kind of like motion. It's like a motion blur, but more so like camera movement motion blur, as if it was like a longer shutter that is kind of shaping the light, and it kind of just adds an extra amount of like depth and style to this, kind of heat wavy. And then I have this embers layer here. Now, this is, let me just add a black background to this so you can actually see what it looks like beyond the transparency. So I have this blue, sparkly, dusty stuff, and this is actually a photo that I took of hundreds that I've been using in a lot of my art. This is an exposure of a cyan laser diode that I have through the mist of a humidifier. So these are actually water droplets being illuminated by, and this is the actual color, a cyan laser diode. And I'm colorizing this with, I'm doing two things to change the color of this. For one, I'm using an exposure adjustment layer just on this embers folder. And then I'm using a gradient map that's looks like this. This is the color scheme. I really like the color scheme because it has a little bit of purple in there, and then the highlights aren't like super saturated yellow, and then adding that, it just gives it this really nice, this nice look. It reminds me of some of the audio spectrogram color maps that I'm so used to seeing, and I'm really fond of that. I'm thinking like Harmer's spectrum, if you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so combining these two things together, you get this. And I'm also using screen mode for compositing these layers together. And then I have just this gradient here, kind of accentuating a little bit more heat down there. A tiny bit of blue up here, tiny bit of blue up there, and now it's starting to have a bit more atmosphere. It's not so sterile. And then I guess I'm using this hue and saturation to make this a bit redder. And then this selective color, which is tweaking it's making the reds up here a little bit darker. I'm increasing the magenta value on these. Yeah, so there's a little bit more of a purplish mid-tone that's coming through here. And then I have this other layer here, which is really just a gradient, lightening up the center. And then I'm using a hue and saturation on colorize mode to make it a little bit warmer. And then this is where the sigil comes in. So this is the original vector smart object of the Moon Lotus. And then I'm using the laser vapor, and I'm basically just overlaying it on top of here. And if you have a layer above another layer that has an alpha, or if it's just like a vector, you can hold down Alt or Option and then click in between them and then use the bottom layer as the mask for the top layer. And then I'm using hue and saturation to change the color of this, hold down Alt, and then click. So then that's being masked as well by the vector smart object. And then exposure, doing the same thing with that, just kind of brightening up. And then I'm using the gradient map again, the same one that we used for the embers down here. And that's how I'm colorizing it. And then I have, basically what I did was I soloed this, I selected all, and then I did a Control-Shift-C, which copies it as like a rasterized rendered image. And then I pasted it back on, and then I applied a Gaussian blur, and this layer is set to linear dodge, and this allows me to have like a little bit of glow come through here. And then I did it a second time. So this is the first iteration of the glow, and then I did it a second time with a larger Gaussian blur amount, and then that just kind of added a bit more glow to it. So combining all this stuff together looks like that. And then the very last bits, I'm using adjustment layers, selective color, bringing up the cyan values so that the blues aren't so dark. And yeah, so we get a little bit more of that cyan up there. And then I'm using brightness and contrast to just turn down the values, because it doesn't need to be that bright. Like it's really vibrant, and I find that a lot of the highlights start getting blown out, and it kind of lacks like the edge and the vibrancy. And then the last thing, I have a vibrance adjustment layer. And this is essentially making the darker colors a little bit less saturated and the brighter colors more saturated by turning the vibrance down and then the saturation up. You can experiment with vice versa, but yeah, I really like this look. It looks a little bit more photographic or filmic, so to speak. And I also want to mention it's really important to set if you're doing all these adjustment layers with like different colors and compositing and exposure adjustments, it's really important to set your image mode to 16 bits per channel. And that way you have a much higher luminance resolution, so you don't get things like banding and stuff in your gradients. But anyway, yeah, that's just a little quick walkthrough of how I made the cover art for Heat. Go check it out.